Well, listen, welcome everybody. I'm Orville Schell, and this is Erich Schwartzel, and we are here to digest his really quite wonderful book, Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. I found it a really wonderful read because I think we are constantly looking for stories that encapsulate in a kind of a comprehensive way what has been going on and what is going on in China. And I think this depiction of the odyssey that Hollywood and the film industry has been on really, in a way that's very interesting, exciting, accessible, and also relates to just about every human being on Earth, does tell us what the trend has been there in China and what we might expect closer. Let's just do like this.
There you go.
Cut to the chase here. And also, I think suggests where things are going to be going in the future. So let's just dive right in here, Eric. Tell us, how did you fall into this story, and when did you know you were onto something that had a good narrative about it?
Right. Well, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I will say Orville's written many books about China, several of which were on my shelf as I wrote this one. But I joined the Wall Street Journal in 2013 covering the film industry. And in 2013, there was this moment where a lot of Chinese money started coming into Hollywood. And this usually would manifest itself in ways like there would be a casting announcement where a Chinese actress would be cast in an X-Men movie, or some Chinese billionaire that no one had ever heard of was financing a slate of movies. And I think there was a sense in Hollywood that this was going to be China's turn to be dumb money, to come to Hollywood, get to go to a couple of movie premieres, and then leave with its tail between its legs. But I started to suspect that there was a political motivation here as well, because this was not happening in a vacuum. China was taking a bigger and bigger position on the world stage, taking a more and more aggressive stance on the world stage. And I started to suspect that the cultural intrusion into Hollywood might be an arm of that. And then especially after, I'd say, Trump's election in 2016, when the global contrast really formed between China and the West, it became pretty clear that the movies, whether they were being made in America or in China, were going to be a bit of a proxy battlefield for those two ideologies.
You know, I had a flirtation with this subject back when, in a sense, your book begins, when it actually looked like, you may remember, 7 years in Tibet and Kundun by Martin Scorsese, and there were one or two others. Films on Tibet, which looked like we were going to put some fingers in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, and Hollywood was rallying to the defense of human rights, of humanism, and Tibet. But what happened?
Well, I mean, I start the book with the example that Orville just described, which is in '97, two movies about the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was very hot at that moment. He was a very popular guy in Beverly Hills. And Martin Scorsese started making a film called Kundun, and Brad Pitt was attached to star in a movie called 7 Years in Tibet, both about a young Dalai Lama and his exile from Tibet. This is in '97, so this is 3 years after Hollywood movies have been playing in China at all. After Mao assumed power, most all Western influence was shut out of the country. So it wasn't until 1994 that movies started to flow in at all. The first American movie let into China at that time was The Fugitive, starring Harrison Ford. It made $3 million, which at the time was a blockbuster, a record. So you can imagine, even by '97, no Hollywood executive is spending a lot of time thinking about how to make money in China. So these movies are put into production, and almost immediately, in fact, the day the cameras start rolling on 7 Years in Tibet, phone calls go into Sony and Disney, the studios behind these films, from the Chinese embassy. and other Chinese officials saying this will prove to be a problem if you release these films. We view it as the language they would always use is we view this as an interference in China's internal affairs. And you might think, well, what do they care, right? They're not making a lot of money in China. But even in 1997, there was a sense that there were fortunes to be made there eventually. And especially in the case of Disney, I think is worth looking at. So Kundun was being made by a subdivision of a much larger parent company. Now, Kundun, though, became a contaminant because it was going to anger China so much. It became a contaminant that threatened the overall structure. So suddenly any aspirations for a theme park that Disney had, or that's for selling toys in China that Disney had, all of that was threatened because they were making a movie that Chinese residents were never going to see. So both of the studios, Sony and Disney, were in a tough spot because they knew if they canceled the films that they would be criticized here in the States for squelching free expression. So they went about it a couple different ways. Disney had Henry Kissinger on retainer, and they sent him to DC to help negotiate on their behalf. Sony had a government relations team in Los Angeles that started buying a bunch of gifts at Tiffany's to take to the Chinese consulate to try and curry favor. Eventually, both movies come out. They still get banned in the country. Sony and Disney were banned. And it wasn't until about a year later that Disney's then CEO, Michael Eisner, went over to China. And there's a transcript of this meeting that he had with a Chinese official that is really just like an author's dream, because it's just a recording of the meeting. And Michael Eisner says, the bad news is that we made this movie. The good news is that nobody saw it. And he essentially grovels his way into getting his company back into the country. And lo and behold, less than 2 decades later, they'd have a $5 billion theme park outside of Shanghai.
Now, Eric, you're getting a little ahead of yourself here. Because I think what's really interesting is when all of this began, everybody thought Hollywood would be on the side of the angels. People hadn't properly identified there was going to be a big market in China. There was going to be a box office, all of these other things. In fact, I think that when those early movies in '97 were made on Tibet, nobody really thought much about that they were going to run into some heavy weather and there were other fish to fry. So what happened that catalyzed the situation so dramatically that not just Hollywood and the studios, but just about every other company in the world suddenly saw things very, very differently?
No, you're right. I mean, and part of it is because China was so loud in its criticism. I think there's a saying in Chinese that translates to "kill the chicken to scare the monkeys," which is the idea that if you can find a very public example to make of something, you can teach everybody a lesson. And so anyone in Hollywood, or as you're pointing out, anyone in Western business really who's seeing Disney banned from China, or Sony banned from China, or Brad Pitt banned from China for making a movie, is going to absorb that lesson. And you better believe that any other script floating around that has to do with Tibet or Tiananmen Square or Taiwan is just going to be too risky to take on.
I went down to just a little footnote when 7 Years in Tibet was shot. It couldn't even be shot in Ladakh, which was in the Himalayas. Certainly couldn't be shot in Tibet. So they went down to Argentina, and on the high desert, they reconstructed Lhasa, and they reconstructed the Potala Palace. And I actually flew down there to watch it and write about it. And I think at that point, there wasn't anybody down there they all thought they were doing the Lord's work. They were going to really stick it to the Chinese. They were going to amplify the story of what had happened to the Dalai Lama, what had happened to Tibet. And now that's the story, of course, also in a certain sense of Xinjiang as well. And yet, before the damn thing came out, the whole situation had started to catalyze in ways that I think your book documents extremely well, that everybody began to see that China was a market that could not be ignored.
Right, and again, I'd point out that this was 1997 when no one was making any money there at all. But it wasn't hard to see. I mean, it was only about 4 years later that China joined the WTO. And then it was about 5 years later that China started building 27 movie screens a day. And as hundreds of millions of Chinese residents moved from farming communities into cities, the box office started to grow at a clip at a time when the American box office started to flatline. So suddenly you had this, not only did you have a brand new market in an industry that thought it had saturated the world, but you had a brand new market that was growing at a time when other major markets were flatlining. And so I think you can imagine the dynamic that we saw in 97 with 7 Years in Tibet. That leverage that China had would only grow as its box office grew. And by the time it would be around 2011 or 2012, it was very clear that China was going to have the number one box office in the world and that studios were going to start making movies with a kind of China first mentality.
And then to make matters even more compounded, Wang Jianlin, this mogul, who was one of these flash-in-the-pan billionaires who arose, started buying things all over the world, and then sort of vanished, bought AMC Studios here. So tell us that story.
Yeah, so Chinese money started becoming important to Hollywood in two ways. One was that box office I mentioned, right? You send a movie to China. If it gets approved by the Chinese censors, you can make couple $100 million at the box office pretty easily. The other way that Chinese money started flowing into Hollywood was behind the scenes in financing. And Wang Jinlin, who was the chairman of Wanda is a massive Chinese real estate conglomerate, and he became China's richest man because he built shopping malls. And whenever you're in a country with the world's fastest growing middle class, being in the shopping mall business is a pretty good business to be in. And the first acquisition he made overseas was of AMC Theaters, which at the time was the second largest chain in the country. It's headquartered in Leawood, Kansas. I've been to its headquarters. It shares a parking lot with a Panera Bread and a JCPenney. It is about as American a company as you can get. And one day its CEO gets a phone call and says, there's a Chinese billionaire who wants to buy the company. And he bought it for about $2.4 billion. At the time, this was around 2012, at the time there were some political consternations, right? There were already politicians saying, are we handing over sort of a propaganda venue for this Chinese billionaire? But the concerns really didn't last very long because the relationship between China and the US was even back then different than it is today. And so he flew to Kansas City with his team of handlers. The CEO of AMC, not knowing what to do, took him out to a Chinese restaurant in Kansas City.
I'm sure that was some good eating.
Yeah, I'm sure they loved that. Yeah, and so they bought the company. They took it public not long thereafter, and actually with funding from the IPO, AMC started implementing this new strategy where they reseated a lot of auditoriums. So if you've been to AMC's recently and you see they have like fewer seats, but they're bigger and cushier recliners, that is a trend that has been financed by Chinese funding. And so it was the first of, I'd say, half a dozen to a dozen major billion-dollar Chinese deals that flowed into American entertainment. And pretty soon, and I think that was when a lot of people in Hollywood started to realize that there was another agenda here coming out of Beijing, which was to learn how to do it themselves.
But I think it's maybe helpful here to add another footnote, and I'd be curious how you respond to this, Eric. Of course, this was the era of engagement. Remember that? And what was the principle of engagement? This began in 1971 and 72 when Kissinger and Nixon went to China. We recognized China in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping came here. And the basic supposition was that it's good to collaborate with China. We want to embrace China. We want to bend the metal of Leninism. We want to incorporate China into the existing global order. So this was very much, I think, in the thinking of whether it's directors or investors or whoever in Hollywood, that they were doing the Lord's work here.
It's a great point. And I mean, I locked the book in late 2021, and around that time, a lot of the stories I told looked even more naive than when I was writing it through 2019 and 2020. And that was one element, which is that it also certainly came up whenever China joined the WTO, where you had everyone from Bill Clinton to Rupert Murdoch saying that China's economic growth and evolution would inevitably lead to democratic reform. And there would inevitably be good political consequences of this kind of economic integration. Bill Clinton saying, any country that gets the internet, is going to have any country that gets the internet is going to have authoritarian regimes fall. Rupert Murdoch saying that dissidents will only be able to communicate via fax machine. There was a real optimism that I think you're right extended through the cultural element, right? Which is that if we can work together, if we could marry the world's largest and the world's second largest film markets in a way, what an amazing back and forth we could have. What an amazing cultural dialogue we could have. And
we would open China up, probably.
Right.
We would change them rather than be changed by them.
Right, which is the folly of so many conquerors throughout centuries past, right? And I think that in Hollywood there was a complacency, because this was one thing that I learned from doing the book, was that Hollywood has been a global power and a global media since its founding. Really, World War I was what allowed Hollywood to sweep the globe. And I think there was a complacency that even if it looked like China was coming over here and Chinese billionaires were buying Hollywood production companies and they were building a box office that looked like it was going to surpass the US, that American entertainment would still always be the default, would still always be the global default.
So, as you've spent a couple of years writing this book, you've given us almost like a film script in its own right of what happened vis-a-vis Hollywood. We did try to embrace China. We did try to engage China. In retrospect, do you think it was naive or what to try to imagine from the perspective of Hollywood that you could win over the Chinese Communist Party and actually help change them in some ways that might integrate them more comfortably into the global order?
I think there was a naivete. I think there are certain corners of Hollywood that thought if only we can get Iron Man into Beijing cinemas, then Xi would fall, and I think that certainly is pretty naive. But I think the more general consensus was probably that that American films, when they would go to the Chinese box office and compete against Chinese films, would always have the upper hand. And what I think started to happen, certainly around like 2012 or 2013, is that China's film industry commercialized and Chinese movies got better and weren't just boring war propaganda films that many people in China had grown up watching. And so as Hollywood had to compete with Chinese comedies and Chinese science fiction epics, they started to see that it was a harder market to crack. And this shouldn't have come as a surprise, because Chinese audiences are inevitably going to prefer Chinese movies the same way that American audiences would always prefer American films over foreign films. And yet it did still come as a surprise. And I think that for a lot of the executives who I spoke to for this book, I don't know if they were naive so much as operating out of very different incentives. There's a saying in Los Angeles that Hollywood thinks in stock market quarters and China thinks in centuries. And a lot of the executives, the great thing about writing a book is that eventually everyone leaves their jobs. So you can talk to them when they're out of the job, because it takes so long. As so many of the people I spoke to for this book are out of the jobs they were in when they were making these decisions. So the decision to censor a film so that Beijing looks strong, or to cut a gay subplot from a film so that your movie gets into China, those were rather easy decisions to make, because they were people keeping their jobs for the next quarter, not necessarily worrying about whether or not this century-long fight between the Western values and Chinese values was going to be swayed by that decision.
And their counterparts, of course, in China were not in and out of jobs and ready to dish when they got out of one job before they got into another. It was a company town, the party. So those people were much less sort of, I think, unpredictable and unreliable. To what degree do you think that the fact that the party really finally controls everything, and particularly the media and film, made it impossible for Hollywood to actually compete in a way that was favorable?
Right. Well, it's never been a fair. Hollywood's never really gotten a fair shake in China. So when you send a Hollywood movie over to be released in China, the first thing that has to happen is it has to be screened by the Chinese censors who are employed by the Communist Party. This is a collection of film studies professors, bureaucrats, retirees who watch a movie, and they'll watch for everything from cosmetic issues like there's a scene in a Mission Impossible movie that featured Tom Cruise running through the streets of Shanghai, and there's dirty laundry drying behind him, and the laundry had to be edited out of the film because the authorities worried that it made China look backwards to have laundry drying outside. So there's that kind of cosmetic concern that they'll have.
Why do you think that there's such an extreme form of sensitivity to looking backward? How do you analyze that?
Because I think the party recognized, as other regimes have in the past, that the American movie, if used effectively, is an incredible global commercial. And that if they could control how China was portrayed in the American movie, they could control how China was portrayed around the world. Because more audiences everywhere are seeing that portrayal in Mission Impossible.
Why did it matter so much to them? I mean, what when if you look at it, what do you think is unique about Chinese culture or sensitivity to the world that makes it such an important matter that they control how they are being viewed, not only at home, but to our surprise, abroad as well?
Well, I mean, it's been described to me as something that I think a lot of us probably first registered with the 2008 Olympics, and the opening ceremony in Beijing, right, which was often referred to as China's coming out party, right? Sort of China's re-entry. And it's been described to me that there are parts of Beijing that think that the last 180 years are a blip in global history, the exception, not the rule, of the Middle Kingdom being the center of the universe, right? And so I think any narrative or visual that blocks that and sends China back to how it might have been viewed in the 20th century is going to be especially triggering for the party. There's and it's interesting because now a lot of the more sensitive things around what the censors will flag regard China looking strong and China looking like a place of progress and sophistication and strength, maybe more so than a place of just economic bounty.
This extreme sensitivity to how China is perceived, and of course, films and Hollywood was one of the biggest global mirrors of how that would be refracted. I think we had a very interesting story. We were in China. This was in 2011, and Meryl Streep was coming to do something that we were engaged in, and she had offered to have the world premiere of Iron Lady, which was just about to come out. And I went to the organization that was sponsoring the trip, and I said, "This is wonderful news for China." And they said, but of course, we need to have the film 3 months before. And I said, "Well, it's not ready. It'll be probably ready a day or two before we screen it." And they said, "Well, in that case, I don't think it will work." And I said, "Why?" Because they said, "Well, we will need to look at it." And I said, "Well, you look at it, and if you don't like it, what will happen?" And they said, "Well, then, of course, we'll want to change it." And I said, I didn't think that was in the cards. Anyway, we did work it out, and we did have the premiere, but they would only allow the premiere to be held in a theater that sat about 200 people, and then only by invitation. And we had Meryl Streep and Jonathan Spence having a conversation about it, and it was a total epiphenomenon. Nobody saw it. It made no difference, but it did bespeak of this profound sort of sensitivity to things coming in from the outside that were not completely under the control of the party.
Right. And also I think you can easily understand how when the sensitivities appear so seemingly minor, how when you're working in Hollywood, you have to really lower your bar and really lower your risk tolerance for what you think might get you in trouble. So, one of the things that was happening in Los Angeles during this time that allowed China to amass such leverage over the American film industry is that the movies started getting bigger and more expensive. I don't need to tell you that almost every movie that comes out in theaters these days is a big Jurassic Park, Marvel Studios superhero movie that probably cost upwards of $300 million to produce. Those numbers require entry into China in order to make a profit at this point. And so nothing in those scripts. I mean, if you see them editing out, dirty laundry,
give us some more examples of some of the more telling moments when Hollywood either without being told to, but often after being told to, change something on a big Hollywood movie to satisfy China. I mean,
there are so many. I mean, and I think it's happening less and less now because studio executives have absorbed so many lessons, and they can do it. They can sort of identify it at a script level. But in the James Bond movie Skyfall, there is a scene in which James Bond breaks into a Shanghai skyscraper and shoots a Chinese security guard. That had to go because it made China look weak. In the movie Green Book, there's a scene where the pianist played by Mahershala Ali is caught in a YMCA with another man, and it's implied that they were caught in the shower together. It's a very PG-13 handling of that plot detail. Nonetheless, when the movie was released in China, the frame was cut so that the other man was invisible, and it looked like he had just been caught in the shower by himself. And then there's also, I think more fascinatingly, so many examples of censors identifying metaphors that they deem problematic. So some of you may remember that in the Men in Black movies, there's a device that the secret agents have, so that if any time a citizen or civilian sees an alien, they can wipe their memories of having seen it. Well, that was not allowed to be shown in Chinese theaters because in an authoritarian regime, that's a metaphor that hinges a little too close to mind control. So they're watching for things, as I said, from the cosmetic to the metaphorical, and I think the most recent example was with the new Fantastic Beasts movie, the new Harry Potter spinoff. There was some dialogue that Warner Brothers had to cut from the film about Dumbledore's homosexuality. And the studio was quick to point out that it was only 6 seconds of footage, but it was 6 seconds that completely eliminated that entire backstory. So again, I think from the studio's perspective, a pretty easy call to make, because it meant getting into China and having access to that box office.
There was the Tilda Swinton Doctor Strange, which I thought was a kind of a unique bit of gymnastics.
Yeah, a bit of a sequel to the Tibet issue, right? Which is that when Marvel was making the Doctor Strange comics, there's a Tibetan monk that functions as the hero's kind of one of his mentors. Well, a Tibetan monk is not going to fly in China, so they cast Tilda Swinton as a Celtic monk.
They might actually fly, but not for the party.
Right, exactly. Fair enough. Yeah. So but that's an interesting problem, because when Disney did that, they got in hot water in the US here for whitewashing the character and casting a white actress in a role that in the comic had been a Tibetan monk, clearly making the calculation that it was it was worth it to alienate domestic audiences here and withstand that issue than to risk not getting into China at all. And I think eventually that Doctor Strange movie did get into China, and I think it made $200 million.
So if we just fast forward to the present, I mean, clearly with wolf warrior diplomacy, a lot of countries increasingly alienated with the invasion of the Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think the worm is turning now in terms of Hollywood's disposition towards the China market and China's disposition towards entering the global market, like AMC and buying things and the going out policy that seems to have come across?
Well, as China has turned inward under Xi over the past few years, access to that market has been harder than ever and less of a sure thing than ever. In fact, I talk to a lot of people in Hollywood who say you really can't count on any movie getting into China right now because it's so unpredictable what the party might do. And it's really led to a number of people in Hollywood kind of whispering that they really got played. Here they spent 15 years devising these business plans only to find themselves shut out of access. But I think around the world is interesting because I think you're right. I think the invasion of Ukraine has sort of reignited this conversation about values. And one thing that I thought a lot about when I was reporting this book was what was happening outside of the US when it came to China's efforts to exert influence. Because some of you may have been following the Belt and Road Initiative that China's been undertaking, which is this patchwork of hundreds really, of infrastructure deals, loan payments, partnerships with countries around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East. And actually what I found was that the Belt and Road Initiative is really allowing them to sort of lay a bit of a distribution network of cultural exporting. So the last chapter of my book takes place in Kenya, where there is a lot of Belt and Road Initiative investment coming in the form of train stations, railways, hospitals, all kinds of things. China has an ubiquity there that you really can't imagine. But one of the, I think, underappreciated elements is this program operated out of Beijing called the 10,000 Villages Project, which is distributing distributing low-cost satellite dishes to 10,000 African villages that carry Chinese movies and TV shows. So if you drive through Kenyan villages, it's easy to spot these bright orange, like Tic Tac orange satellite dishes atop apartment buildings. And chances are, if you go in, you might find people watching Chinese soap operas or Monkey King cartoons. I spent one evening having dinner with a family while we watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So I think it's important to look outside the U.S. because certainly the attitude toward China is turning by the day in the U.S., but I'm not sure it's turning as quickly in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how you look at the notion of decoupling, if there's a special variant of decoupling that's going on in the entertainment industry, that whole process is certainly a trend.
Not quite, I don't think, because even if the studios, so let's say like we're working at Universal right now and we have a new Jurassic Park movie coming out, even if we're unsure that it'll get into China, there's still no way that you can make any movie that will alienate China. So I don't think that the new climate is sort of getting everyone to dust off their Tiananmen Square scripts. And it's because if you take a Tiananmen Square script into Universal, they might say, yeah, at the studio level, we don't know if we're working with China in 5 years. But at the parent company level, we just opened a theme park outside of Beijing. We're owned by NBC Universal, which is owned by Comcast. Somewhere in the parent company, there have to be divisions that need to maintain that access. And so I think with all this talk now of the sanctions in Russia and the economic exodus out of Russia after Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, that dynamic looks very different if China were to make a move on Taiwan. That kind of exodus would be, I think, all but impossible for most Western businesses right now.
And yet, that's what people sort of thought about Russia. And companies did not have scenario planning, and now they're writing down billions of dollars.
Right.
So, I mean, it just goes to show that, we may be in a period where the things that have been unimaginable become imaginable. And I wonder, you mentioned Taiwan. If that is China's sort of revanchist Ukraine, what do you think would happen to the commons of entertainment if China moved on Taiwan?
So that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it would depend on America's response, right? If we saw a sort of a mobilizing of American response like we did when it came to the support for the Ukraine, right? Would we see a similar response if China moved on Taiwan? I'm not sure. And I don't know what kind of patience there would be for an economic involvement in a Chinese move on Taiwan. I mean, I think as I was reporting this book, China really absorbed Hong Kong. And
without a bump in the road, practically.
Essentially, I mean, in today's news of the rubber stamp election as evidence of that as anything. And I went to Hong Kong. I think the last time I was there was early 2019, and it was during the protests in the streets, and it was surreal because you would see news coverage of the demonstrations, but then walk outside at 7 a.m. to go for a jog, and the streets would be completely pristine because there had, the authorities had made sure that there was no evidence of any, littering or any sign that there had been any consternation the night before. And what I found interesting, because then obviously as I was writing the book, the situation in Hong Kong and friends in Hong Kong would describe a situation that grew more and more dire. But what I was fascinated to learn, and I think about this a lot when it comes to prognostications about whether or not China will do anything to Taiwan, is that many, many years ago, there was a movie I'm sure all of you are major fans of. It's called Transformers: Age of Extinction. It's the fourth film in the Transformers franchise. It came out in 2014, directed by Michael Bay, about a bunch of fighting killer robots. That's all you need to know. But these movies are very popular in China. And in 2014, the studio behind Transformers, Paramount, decided they wanted to make as much money there as possible. And so they decided to cast Chinese actors. They had a bunch of Chinese product placement. And they even submitted the script for approval from Beijing. This is in 2014. And the authorities there read the script, and they said, "This is great, looks good. We only have one note, which is that in the third act, when Hong Kong is being destroyed in the big climactic robot battle, the Americans come to rescue Hong Kong before the Chinese arrive. We'd like the Chinese to arrive first." And if you watch the movie today, there's a very random cut in the middle of this big climactic, skyscraper demolishing fight. There's a really random cut to Beijing where the Beijing defense minister says, "We will protect Hong Kong at all costs." And you see Chinese soldiers arrive in Hong Kong, mainland Chinese soldiers arrive in Hong Kong before the Americans do. And this is the movie that was shown in theaters around the world. And this was in 2014. And it wouldn't be for another 5 or 6 years that we would see that kind of off-screen reality take shape. And so I think one thing that going back in history like that allowed me to do with this book was to, I think, take the party at its word and see that when there are signs of that kind of activity, that kind of movement, that kind of aggression, it's often far earlier than we may have remembered.
Yeah, the first sort of green shoots of that. In a certain way, I think you could say that if there is one actor that is kind of the litmus paper in the acid bath of this China drama, it would be Richard Gere.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So to tell everybody a little bit about his progress and how he started and what happened to him and why he's relevant to your story.
Well, Richard Gere, perhaps more than anyone, but maybe Steven Seagal, right, was the Dalai Lama's biggest cheerleader in Hollywood in the 1990s. He even interrupted the Academy Awards ceremony before that was cool, to talk about the human rights abuses in Tibet in 1993. And he was able to sort of straddle that line for a long time and star in films, but also, wear his prayer beads on the carpet and meet with the Dalai Lama from time to time. But then as China's economic leverage grew over Hollywood and its power grew, Richard Gere became completely radioactive. And he hasn't starred in a major studio film since 2009 because...
So it's not just that he can't be shown in China, but that China's put the kibosh on his ability to be negotiable in the rest of the world.
I mean, think about it this way. So if you're casting, I think about him now as he's sort of in one of those, he's sort of graduated into those emeritus roles, right? He's sort of the guy who comes in to like advise Batman or something like that. And if you are casting one of those movies and you're hoping that it will get into China and make money at its box office, are you really going to take the risk when you can just call Gary Oldman or you can call Dustin Hoffman, right? Because any movie that has a single frame of Richard Gere is not going to play in a Chinese theater. And to take it even a step further, casting him in any movie might risk other films on the studio's slate, right? So maybe
and the toy business and
in the toy business,
peripherals.
I mean, exactly. He becomes a sort of like this radioactive hub that threatens everything. And when I set out to write this book, that was one of the big questions I had because, I mean, as you know, people in Hollywood are so nice, and they would tell me that it was bullshit that Richard Gere had been blacklisted by China. They said, he was never that good an actor. One guy told me that he was always getting John Travolta's sloppy seconds anyway. But it turns out I talked to a casting executive at Warner Brothers who told me that there wasn't a list that went around. There wasn't a memo that went around, but the attitude was, if you can get somebody else, just get somebody else. And Richard Gere, he's talked about this himself. He has said, there are movies and there are times where he and his representatives have been told, not with him.
It's almost 10 of the hour. Let's take some questions.
I wonder, we're all here talking about this in a self-evidently negative way. I wonder, is this how the sort of top executives at Comcast or at Disney would be talking about this? Is there a sense among them that this is heading in the wrong direction, or is this a price that they're all aware of and willing to pay?
It's a good question. I think I quote an executive in my book who I think said the quiet part out loud, where he told me, I would not see myself as the standard bearer of Western democracy. I'm here to make money. And I think that if there was a third chair here and the head of one of the studios was here, they'd say that this is a market reality, that Hollywood films are censored for dozens of markets, and that it's really rather unfair to conscript Hollywood into doing America's bidding, which is interesting. I mean, because they would say I'm running a global business here, right? When 60% of my revenues are coming from overseas markets, how can you expect me to worry about what American politicians think of the work I do? And I think that I can understand that from an economic perspective. I think where the tension emerges is that we have conscripted Hollywood in the past into doing America's bidding, right? There's a reason why Hollywood is the most famous element of American soft power. Going back to the days of the Marshall Plan, we've leaned on Hollywood to exert its kind of gravitational pull toward America. There's this quotation that I love that said that Hollywood allowed America to become this empire by invitation, and that even through the 80s during the Cold War, we wanted to see American interests reflected on screen. It's just that the economic reality of the last 20 years doesn't allow for that.
Of course, there's a paradox here because back in the engagement period, we thought, we were ganged up with China against Russia. Mm-hmm. Then USSR collapsed. And so we had a new operating system for engagement and it was that open markets will equal open societies. And so we thought that Hollywood would be part of that equation. And then we subsequently, I think, have learned that too was something of a fiction. And so we had no operating system to sustain engagement any longer, and it died.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Next question.
Yeah, I would posit that in talking about cultural supremacy.
Maybe put the microphone closer to your mouth.
Yeah, I would posit that cultural supremacy, the United States was always interested primarily in money, and not what would the profit be in China. I think you're underestimating that. In fact, that has succeeded. In other words, our cultural supremacy of capitalism, in the sense that consumerism has succeeded. We transmitted that to China so that they're even better than us now, so that they're threatening our values. So they actually have, we have given that to them. They have succeeded. A couple of things.
Well, let's answer that before we move on.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, and I was surprised to learn just how much of the student-teacher dynamic that you're identifying there was evident even in the early days of Hollywood films moving into China. I opened the book with this scene that took place in 2008 at UCLA, where a group of Chinese authorities, bureaucrats, executives went to UCLA for essentially a master class in all how Hollywood worked. And they had studio chiefs come in, they had agents come in, they had producers come in, and essentially tell them, this is how we built this empire. This is how we built this show business, this empire. And like I said, that was 2008, long before I think anyone expected China's entertainment industry to become the, let's say, capitalist force that it is.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not even sure that, films will be screened in this country in movie theaters anymore in the next 5 to 10 years. Everything's gone to streaming, and so the whole industry is in sort of this transformation. So how's that affecting this picture of, this AMC that might look like a pretty bad investment in 5 years, and the ability of China to influence Hollywood and vice versa.
Yeah, it's a great question because I think COVID changed so much and accelerated so many trends. In late 2020, when most movie theaters in the US were still closed, the movie theaters in China had reopened. And that was actually what allowed China to become the #1 box office in the world and finally surpass the US. We all thought it would happen within the next 4 or 5 years. COVID allowed it to happen much sooner. And the other thing that came out of COVID was a drastic reduction in the number of movies that are going to be released in theaters at all. And I think that this is having a little bit of a bifurcated response here. So I think let's look at the theatrical element. So if studios are releasing fewer films in theaters, that means that the films they're releasing have to be bigger, probably more expensive, and have to make more money. That's going to increase China's leverage because those are going to be like Doctor Strange this past weekend. It's going to be the Jurassic Park movies. It's going to be those big budget films, the Fast and Furious. Those are the kinds of movies that are going to be coming out, and they're going to really want a China release. That increases China's power. I think streaming operates a little bit differently because mainland China does not allow Netflix, does not allow Disney Plus. Mainland China has really been quite protective of their own streaming services. And so a lot of those services aren't in China right now. That lowers their leverage. But the thing I would say is, I don't necessarily think this means that we're going to have a ton of creative freedom vis-a-vis the stories that the studios tell about China, because all of these streaming services are still owned by parent companies. The one exception I'd say is probably Netflix. Netflix has tried desperately to get into mainland China, and when executives finally realized that it was never going to happen, that did give them a little bit of a longer leash. So you will see on Netflix certain movies and some documentaries that you probably wouldn't see elsewhere, because they kind of skirt the line of being critical of China. Netflix certainly censors a lot of content in other countries, but China is one that they don't really have to worry about.
I mean, there is a long tradition of people who wanted to get into China and media and entertainment from Murdoch on down, and there haven't been a lot of success stories. What do you think the prognosis going forward will be?
There haven't been a lot of success stories, and I think there is I think an interesting success story, which I would say is IMAX, the company that operates the big premium big screen auditoriums. They have done rather well in China, and I think it's telling when you examine how. One is that they only show the movies; they don't make them, so they don't have to worry about the pesky censorship traps that the studios fall into. But the other thing is that they very strategically turn themselves a little Chinese in order to work in the market. They moved their headquarters from Singapore to Beijing. They hired a ton of former party officials to work locally. They started screening Chinese-made films in IMAX theaters in China, and they've been able to straddle the line pretty well. But I think it's telling that in order to do so, they've had to really take some pretty significant steps toward making sure that Beijing knows that they are there to stay, that they're loyal, and that they will do what's asked of them.
But even they, and perhaps Tesla, I mean, once China doesn't need them, it will find ways to replace them.
Right. This is the tension, right? There's this concept in business known as technology transfer, right? Which is that in order to access the Chinese market, there has to be some kind of handover, right? It might be if Boeing wants access, they hand over the airplane engine blueprints. And there was always a sense, I think, in Hollywood, well, what does technology transfer mean for storytelling, right? Well, it turns out that it is possible, and that over the past several years, Chinese producers and production companies very regularly will hire American actors, directors, writers to go over and polish scripts or direct movies or build sets and help them kind of catch up on all the experience that America has and bring it back to Chinese sets.
So one more question. Okay.
How hard was it to follow the Chinese money? And is the phenomena that you're describing evidence that America is on the Belt and Road Initiative? Thank you.
Oh, that's an interesting theory. I like that. Is America sort of an unwitting participant in the Belt and Road Initiative? I wouldn't say necessarily a participant in the initiative so much as in a position where it's doing China's work for it. Right. But I think on the first question about following the Chinese money, never an easy task. I would say that, there's a lot, following the money. It gets very opaque very fast. And there were certainly, I met a number of, executives in Hollywood who knew this better than anyone because they were still waiting on money that had never materialized. I will say that I think reporting this book in China, there were obviously some major sensitivities. The one constituency that I found was more cautious than any when it came to speaking with me freely were Americans working in China. That seemed to be the group that was the most skittish. There's a story in the book of meeting with an executive, and before we could even start talking, she took her cell phone out and turned it off, and then she put it in a signal blocking case that she carries with her, and then she moved it to the other side of the restaurant, and then she wondered if she should go put it in her car. And we were meeting at a restaurant in Burbank. We were not in Beijing. And I don't necessarily think she was being paranoid or overreacting.
One more question.
It's for sale.
I hope this is relevant. You're talking a lot about the control of social critique in China, but I remember a spate of wonderful movies, Raise the Red Lantern, Red Sorghum, To Live. They all were powerful social critiques, and they were produced in partnership, or like they were Chinese productions, no?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a fascinating little chapter in Chinese cinema history. The movies you all described, and I would add my favorite, which was Farewell, My Concubine, from the 80s and 90s, are part of a movement known as the Fifth Generation. And these were Chinese directors who entered the Beijing Film Academy the first year it reopened after Mao's death. And they started making movies, as you described, that really interrogate Chinese history, especially with regards to the Cultural Revolution. They were critically acclaimed, played every major festival, won major prizes at those festivals, but were never seen in China. That's the key difference there, is those movies were adored and viewed the world over, but banned by Chinese authorities. And I have to say, one of the rather depressing arcs of the book is how many of those filmmakers were steadily absorbed by the state. And so many of those fifth generation filmmakers still make movies in China, but chances are they're making movies that are far more sanctioned and far more commercial and far more in line with what the authorities want them to be producing.
And Eric, I think it's fair to say that those films were made during an incredibly open period in the early 80s, which sort of ended in 89 and then had a recrudescence in the 90s for a few years. But that is a past period where those kinds of independent filmmakers could have a life even outside of China.
Exactly.
Well, have we come to the end of our appointed time?
Thank you, everyone.
It's a wonderful read, so I urge you to pick it up.